with your team in a collaborative way. Thank you very much for tuning in and watching this video. I really appreciate your time and that you have a thirst for knowledge about narrative design. It is an evolving art, science, ongoing experiment. So any feedback would be very
David
grateful.
Coleman presents
and I'm available on Twitter,
real-time
so
character
please
dynamics.
reach out if you have any questions or comments about this. And I hope I do get to talk to you all in person really soon. Thank you.
So my name is David Coleman, and I'm a technical art director at the Coalition.
So I'm just going to take the opportunity to summarize some key points.
Real-time
the high concept formula was the kind of first
So
big one
before
that
I get started,
using.
though, I'm going to show a little
there's
video
the variables there for you,
that shows our
There's a
game.
bit of an explanation and some examples. Take a look at those in your own time. Also, these are dramatic forces.
Find what you're looking for.
You've got the reversals, you've got escalations, you've got transformations.
And now we need to kill it.
Obviously, storytelling. So, this is about
I'm not gonna lie.
establishing
It's real ugly out
dramatic
there.
forces should be above what is.
Can we watch each other's backs? Like always.
And then we've got these dramatic forces between elements, synergy, opposition, absence.
You got it, Carmine.
Use all of these in the example today. Absence is particularly tricky.
Ooh, you see that spray? A clean kill.
Also, there's just the list of So thank you, that's all from me today. I really appreciate you spending the time.
About the blood.
I am available on Twitter, please reach out. I always like to get
We gotta leave now!
and of course, if you want to see the product,
Come out, wherever you are! You remember me? Now's the fun part, bitch!
Okay, so as you saw in that video, we have a lot of different characters and monsters and all kinds of things. So what I'm going to be talking about today is the dynamics, as I mentioned, but I'm going to start with the Gears of War 4 dynamics that we came from before we started developing Gears 5. And I'm going to talk about what were our goals for our dynamic system as we started pre-production in Gears 5. I'll talk about the system that we ultimately developed, which is called Rod Dynamics, and what that process was like as we developed that system. And then I'll show some of the workflow in using that system, along with some examples of different creatures that we set up. And then I'm going to talk about some of the challenges that we ran into with this system. And at the end, I'll kind of show some of our results in our cinematics, in our gameplay, and different scenarios. I'll summarize, and then we would have some time for questions if this was a live event, but if you want to reach out to me, I'm sure you can find me on LinkedIn. Okay, so let's get into it, with starting with Gears of War 4. So in Gears of War 4, we primarily used PhysX cloth for our dynamic system, and that was kind of limiting for us because we found that the performance with our performance goals was really limiting us to only using 50 vertices per character, which is not a lot. It's not very high quality at that point. So we were primarily using PhysX cloth, but we also used some Unreal Anim dynamics for rigid body dynamics. We also had some examples of using ragdoll physics, specifically for a carrier tail, which I'll be going into more later in the presentation. So ultimately, we had these multiple systems that we had to manage, and that made them challenging to iterate on. Each of these systems had their own challenges for iteration, but even the fact that they were different systems brought their own challenges. We found that these systems were pretty performance costly for our goals, and the other major problem that we had was that all of our cinematics, we had to do keyframe animation for all the secondary things like cloth and hair and so on and so forth. And so that's definitely not ideal. The cinematic animators didn't want to really be working on that. They want to work on performance, which is what they should be working on. So overall, our quality was kind of limited when it came to dynamics for Gears of War 4. So with Gears of War 5, obviously, we wanted to have higher quality visuals. So that was kind of one of our main pillars, like just make it look way better. But we also want to make it in a unified way so that we didn't have the problem of disparate systems. And we wanted to, of course, address the problem that we had with our cinematics. So we switched in Gears 5 to using all real-time cinematics. So we wanted to make sure that the dynamic systems would work in that kind of environment. Of course, the system has to support our challenging performance goals that we had. And really, that was 60 frames per second in all game modes on Xbox One X. So that's campaign, that's multiplayer, all of it, always 60 frames a second, which is definitely a challenge. We had to come up with making sure that we could have a dynamic system that would support all of the different character complexity that we were looking at in our concept art. So lots of different hair, ponytails, dreadlocks. We had lots of capes and chains and bandoliers and chains and leather straps that are tied onto a character. And we also had a lot of these concepts coming that were robots that were infected by what we call the swarm. And so that means that we had lots of tentacles kind of dangling off of them. So with those goals in mind, we led on to this path of, okay, well, let's develop a system that will meet all of those goals, because we really didn't find anything out there that would meet all of the goals in the way that we wanted to approach them, particularly when it came to performance. So we asked ourselves, how can we achieve these goals? And so we thought, well, if we can simulate both rigid and soft body dynamics, we could unify those systems. Sorry, if we could simulate bones for both rigid and soft body dynamics, then we could unify those systems. And so we discovered, well, we tried some multiple bone chains and just standard linear skinning, and we could kind of create rigging that would support that and look, fairly decent. Luckily for Gears, we have characters that have, thick leather cloth and stuff. We don't have a lot of like silky fabric and stuff. So that really helped us as well. So then that led us to, well, what if we can apply position-based dynamics to bones? And I'm going to talk about what position-based dynamics is, but basically it's what most of the game systems use nowadays, PhysX, Havoc, etc. So we thought, let's try and apply that to bones directly instead of to the vertices. So at a super high level in terms of our development, we started with position-based dynamics, and that led us to looking at another paper called Position and Orientation-Based Cosseret Rods. And ultimately, from those two papers, we developed a system called Rod Dynamics. Okay, so let's talk about position-based dynamics so that we have a foundation of what the system is built upon. So it's used, like I said already, it's used by many game cloth systems such as Havoc and PhysX cloth. And it's just a collection of particles with constraints between them. So collisions are resolved by projecting the particles outside of collision bodies. And so here I have an example of just walking through step by step, frame by frame, of a very simple single bone chain here. So we're going to imagine that the root bone there is pinned in place so it can only rotate. And so we set up our particles at our root and at our end. And then we measure the distance between that root and that end to give us a length constraint. And then we update the particle's velocities by starting with some gravity. And so then we can estimate, well, where's the particle going to move with that gravity? So we push it down there. And then we generate our collision constraints. And in this frame, the particle is outside of collision, so it doesn't really matter. And then we resolve iteratively between the collision and the length constraint itself. And then we can look at what was the velocity from previous frame to this frame, and then we can carry that velocity forward to the next frame, and at the same time, update our bone positions to match these particles. And so then for the next frame, we start adding some more gravity. So here we add that, and we get our new updated position, and we regenerate our collision constraints, and we find the particles inside the collision. So then we project that particle outside of the collision, but then you can see that that particle is very far away from its root particle. And so that's where we would iteratively resolve between the collision constraint and the length constraint to find the proper particle position. And then we look at the previous frame's position to get our velocity, and we carry that forward, and so on and so forth. So for every frame, we're going to be kind of going through that iteration. So that system kind of has some limitations, particularly when you're looking at it for a bone-based system, which is what our goal was. So the thing is that particles are just positions in space. They don't have an orientation. And so if you want to apply some bending constraints onto the bones that are in your system, then that requires additional bookkeeping that's kind of outside of this system. You can't model twist and torsion with the particles. Like you won't be able to get any of that kind of twisting or rotation. So that's kind of a major limitation. So fortunately, a recent extension to position-based dynamics addresses those problems. And that's position and orientation-based cost-ret rods. So it basically extends it by simulating both bending and twisting of flexible rods. And so it adds orientation and angular velocity into the system. And it works alongside position-based dynamic particles and their velocities. So you can kind of think of it as two systems working together to create your ultimate animation. Okay, so let's go through the cost-ret rods in the same example. So here we set up our particles at the root and at the end, and then we get the same length constraint like we did before. And then the new thing is the rod that we insert into the system. And so just like before, we update the particle velocities, and we find our particle position here, and we generate our collision constraints just like before, and we resolve our length constraint. And now the new thing is that the rod, it gets taken into a place. And so if I just go back and forth here, you can see that the particle and the rod are becoming in a collinear space. So they're resolving themselves together. So the rods have a stiffness in this place so that you can see that they don't quite meet each other, but they're resolving themselves together. And so we then move forward with updating our particle velocities and also our rod angular velocities, and we can carry those forward to the next frame. And so again, we go through and we add our gravity to the particle to get its new particle position. We then add our angular velocity to the rod, and then we find the particle is inside of our collision constraint, so we pop that out, and then we resolve its length constraint, and then we resolve between the rod system and the particle-based dynamic system to give us our ultimate end frame here. And then, of course, we carry forward our velocities to the next frame and update. And so, again, I just want to highlight the difference between position-based dynamics and cost-ret rod system is that the cost-ret system has the position-based dynamics, but it adds into it this notion of these rods to give us the control over the bone stiffness themselves. So we can apply, all kinds of twist and bending constraints. So that really helps, especially when you're going to a system that's based on bones. So with those two papers, we were able to develop rod dynamics. And so now I'm going to talk about our implementation of rod dynamics, and we'll start with some terminology. So here we have a bone chain, and here we apply the particles to that bone chain. This is what we call a strand. So it's a strand of particles and rods. And here we have a strand root. And as a parent, we have a root bone parent here. So the reason that is important is because we might want to apply some stiffness to that strand root. And so we have to have a reference to its parent bone, so it's stiff in relation to that. And then in between the particles, we have the rods, of course. And of course, these are the particles themselves. Okay, so like I said, this is a strand. And we have this novel feature where we can add a strand width. And so what this is it's still just a single bone chain, but it has particles that are projected out to the sides there. And so what that allows us to do is if something were to come and bump against either the left or the right side of those particles, it would create twist on that bone chain. So that's really what those are for. If you were to use this kind of a setup on, maybe a plane of cloth, like a skirt that we have in the front, maybe like a leather armor, then it wouldn't really give you any bending and folding because it is just a single bone chain. So it would twist and stuff, but it really wouldn't give you proper behavior. So that's when you would have to create a system that has multiple strands together like this. Now, the problem with this, though, is that those individual strands are completely loose to each other. They just act like chains that are dangling. And so we really need to have cross-linking between those strands. And so here you can see that it draws those yellow lines between the particles. And we can control how close they get to each other and how far they can move apart from each other as well. And so by tying a system together like this, we can start to create a cloth system. We have another feature with strands that I wanted to talk about as well, which is called end anchoring. So we have a root bone, but then we can also tie the end of a chain to a different bone so that it kind of swings, as if it's attached to the start and the end. So that's kind of a useful feature for a lot of the character designs that we had as well. So for collision objects, we have a number of different objects, so I'll talk through those. So we have an infinite plane. This looks like a finite plane, but we just render it that way just because it gets so cluttered on our screen if it's truly infinite. And then we have the major collision the major collision object is a capsule. And we use these primarily over most of the other collision objects. We also have cones, and this is something that we can use to keep strands inside of or outside of cones. And then similarly, we have a frustrum, which is just a shape like this. Finally, we have a floor plane, which looks a lot like an infinite plane, but the only special thing about that is it follows along with the floor plane, which at times can be ramped, so it can be up or down slopes. Okay, so all of this raw dynamic setup actually happens in what we call a post-physics animation blueprint. So this is an animation blueprint that evaluates after all of the animation systems and after all of the physics systems, then it runs a post-physics graph, which is, the ideal location for your dynamics to happen, is at the end of all the animation evaluation. So I'm going to talk through how we set these things up. So this is a simple example of a cloth that's on the front of this drone here. And so you can see it's got some collision on his legs, and it has some a sheet of strands on his front leather armor there. And so I'm going to talk through each of these nodes that is in the graph that represent that. So here you can see I'm highlighting the raw dynamics node itself. And then we have strand topology variables. And so what that means is it's just the variable that can control what is the bones that are assigned into there and its many parameters to define a strand. And then we also have collision variables, and that's just the variable that has the collision objects in it. And then finally, we have a wind variable, which we can use to control how wind affects these strands. So looking at just the raw dynamics node, you can see there's a lot of parameters there, and I'm not going to go through all of them in detail, but at a high level, we have things like gravity and wind scale, whether or not this raw dynamics node is impacted with floor collision. It's simply a checkbox. We have many solver parameters, most of which we don't actually touch. We did through our pre-production to kind of find the right default settings, and then we left it alone for the most part. We might touch solver stiffness and solver iterations there, but most of these didn't need to be used. Then we also have alpha control. So what this does is it allows us to give the animators moments where they can take control of the dynamics. So for example, let's say a character runs their hand through their hair, and we're running that hair through dynamics normally. So the animator would be able to turn on when they'd want to control that hair, animate it themselves, and then blend back into the dynamic system. And so this was the alpha plugin for that. We also have control over the teleportation settings and maximum speed. So often in our cinematics, the characters are teleporting from one location to another for different camera cuts, and so we'd have to tune those parameters for that sometimes. And then finally, we have LOD settings here. So sometimes dynamics are just a little minor thing that you might see close up, but you'd never see them at a distance, so we can definitely turn those off. Okay, so topology variables. This represents the variables that controls the strands. So here you can see I've highlighted 3 areas, and that's where you would set the root bone of the strand. And the system goes through and it finds all of the children of that root bone that you specify. So you don't have to specify all of the bones. Of course, we also have a filter on that too if you needed it. And then here we have what we call child particle settings or child bone settings. And so this is where you would set the stiffness values and things like that for each of the particles. And so here you can see child depth. And so what that means is that at child depth 0, that's the root of the bone. And then at the next one, it's child depth of 2. So that would mean it steps down the one bone child and then another bone child. So that's 2. And you might notice that there isn't a child bone settings for depth of 1. And that is because those values interpolate down the chain. So it's kind of a workflow optimization where we didn't need to specify every bone. We could kind of quickly set up the beginning and the end, or maybe the beginning and the middle, and then it would copy the middle down to the end. So it would give us a lot of flexibility for quickly iterating on these values. Because as you can see, there's a lot of values there to control. And that also works across strands. So here you can see that there is no child bone settings for those other 2 strands. And that means that it's going to just use the child bone settings that are on that first strand. So it also interpolates across the strands. Up at the top here, you can see we can control damping and drag. And so now I'm going to move on to our collision variables. And so this is just simply how we define our collision objects. So here you can see we set what the parent bone is for that, in this case it's a capsule, but we can also control it to be in the coordinate space of a different bone. And so this is really useful. For example, our ankle bones are kind of angled downwards, but it can be awkward to kind of move a capsule in relation to that angle. So we could feed it into a different bone that is lying flat on the floor, and it'll be still in the space of whatever we set as its parent, but we're modifying its position in relation to the coordinate space bone. So that was kind of a handy feature. This is literally the values for the beginning and the end of the capsule, and then also its radius. And so unfortunately, we had to literally type in the values for defining these capsules, which is not ideal. We only had so much time for development, though. So I think in the future, it'd definitely be handy for us to develop some kind of a 3D widgets thing so we can literally, control it in viewport. But we lived with it as it was. We had a lot of work to do. So moving on. So wind variables. So Gears 5 has 4 levels of wind. And so this allows us to set a wind speed per level of wind. And so you can see it has a minimum and a maximum wind value. And then there's also this gustiness, and that would determine how fast it goes back and forth between that minimum maximum. And so we had this in-editor way of being able to tune these things. And so here you can see that I've got a control over what the wind strength is. So if we dial that up, you can see we can go all the way to like crazy storm wind. And then we can dial it down to something that's still, pretty noticeable. And we have a widget here to be able to control the direction of the wind as well. And so if we select the rod dynamics node itself, that shows us where all of our particles and rods are and the collision as well. So that was a really handy in-editor tool to be able to tune our wind parameters. Okay, so now that we've talked about all of the variables and all of the things that get plugged into rod dynamics, now I want to bring it back to, let's talk about how we made a character set up with this system. So I'll start with the Warden, who was one of our most challenging characters. And he was one of the most challenging because he had multiple layers of clothing here. So you can see he's got a major cape there, and then a secondary cape kind of lying over top, and then chains in between those two things. So that's kind of a dynamics nightmare in terms of making them all move independently from each other, but not clipping through each other. So this is the animation graph for all of the different rod dynamics nodes that we had for this character. And this ultimately meant that it was pretty expensive. This guy was pretty expensive. He was our most expensive dynamics character in the game, for sure. And so let's just walk through the parts of the cape that we had to set up here. So here you can see, for the main part of the cape, we have 3 strands. So you can kind of see them kind of running down from the root of his cape downwards. And we set up the entire body to have collision objects on it so that it would just react to everything on him. And then in between those strands, we have pretty tight cross-linking because you don't want those strands moving too far towards each other or away, or you get a lot of texture stretching and shearing. But you can see that in this part of the cape, it's pretty torn. And so in that area, we can go through and say, oh, you're allowed to have a very wide cross-linking. So it would kind of be able to move away from the rest of the strand. So we kind of had a level to be able to control that. So on the next layer here, you can see that second bit of cloth up at the back top there. So this is just one strand that branches out into 4 ends. And so those 4 ends are just, they're kind of tears of the cloth itself. And so they don't need to be cross-linked or anything. And their collision was on the main cape itself. And so you can see those collision capsules there. They're actually associated to the bones that are on the major part of the cape. So as the cape would move around, this secondary cape would kind of move in relation to that. Then we had 2 strands here for the dangling chains that are in between. And so you can see these chains could wrap around his arms and all that, but they also had collision in the ones that are in red. You can see there's collision with the main bit of the cape, and then those 2 kind of at the top there, those are representing the collisions for that secondary bit of cape. So it'd kind of move around in between those to kind of keep them from clipping through each other. And so for the next bit, we had this little dangling chain here, and this one is tied from one clavicle and it's anchored to the other clavicle, so that as he kind of moves his shoulders back and forth, that chain would kind of get tighter or looser depending on the position. And so as you can see, there's collision on both the capes here as well, so it's kind of sandwiching it between the main cape and the secondary cape. So that's kind of a view into all of the different layers that we had to set up on the Warden. And let's just take a look at an example of it in the game.
What is that?
We might have a problem. Yeah, we definitely have a problem.
Warden!
Okay, so the next character that I'm going to talk about is what we call the rejects. And so the rejects were robots that were infested with the swarm. And so they really have a lot of different looks to them. And so that was one of our main goals with this character, is that we wanted to create a mesh that could look different in all of the ways that the swarm had infested them, but with a single mesh. So to give us that visual variety. And so that's why I called this slide Dynamic Dynamics, because we really made a system with swappable regions, and each of those regions had their own dynamics. And so we also had a gameplay need to be able to shoot off his arms and legs and so on and so forth. So this skeletal mesh had to be very flexible, and the dynamics had to work along with that. So here I've got an example of a animation prototype to just prove out the functionality of the skeletal mesh. And so here you can see we can control a slider here to separate his upper torso, and we can also twist it forward and backwards too. So we would make sure that we could give the control to the animators to be able to position this, but we wanted to make sure that the mesh would be able to do all these things. And so you can see here, even the right side is able to split apart. And then we can take his head portion of his torso and make it attached to the left side or the right side, or even somewhere in between. So we could really get a lot of variety out of just changing these kind of parameters. And then we had swappable parts here. So here you can see on his face that we break off a portion of it and expose some new tentacles and their dynamics. And here we have some chest parts. So if you take a look at his chest, you're going to see that's going to change, and there's going to be a new dangling tentacle, a pretty gross one, hanging out of there. And so here we can start breaking off the arms, and that would also expose new tentacle dynamics from breaking them off as well. And then you can also shoot this character's legs off. So here we have an animation of him crawling on the ground, and we can start breaking his legs off. And then that, of course, exposes some tentacles. These ones are kind of small. If you shoot off his entire pelvis, then you can see we get this rather gross-looking guts and tentacles hanging out of there. So that was great. The skeletal mesh was working. The dynamic systems were working. And so then basically we provided this prototype, and then we started hooking it up into the game itself. And so here you can see in our test gym, just using the game itself to test out these features of the mesh. So here we can shoot off some of his arms. And you can see if you give this character enough damage, he's going to kind of self-destruct. And so here we shoot out his leg, and he'll blow himself up. So here, if you shoot him in the pelvis twice, you can see that that breaks off the pelvis, and it went flying off into the background there. And that exposes the guts and tentacles like I showed before. And then we can just start combat here so that he chases after you. And so here we have a gameplay feature too. So we can shoot off of the head, and then we can expose this power supply. And if you shoot that, then that destroys the character. So we have these swappable parts affecting, gameplay as well as dynamics. So here I have a video that we showed at E3. I wanted to show this because it shows the variety that I've talked about. Although this is a pretty hectic scene, so let's just watch this. Okay, so now I'm going to move on to multiplayer characters, and we have a lot of multiplayer characters in our game. So these meshes that you're seeing here, these 5 meshes, these are playable as multiplayer, but they're also the exact same meshes and their dynamics that are used as the enemies in campaign. So we didn't create different versions of them. They are the same assets. And so we had a lot of characters. What we shipped was 66 multiplayer characters at launch. And since then, we've added 80 more. And there's a lot more coming. We have a lot of characters coming still. So one thing before I start playing this video, I want to point out that we have different proportions in our game as well that we have to support. So with Kate being the heroine here, she is smaller than our regular male or swarm drone kind of standard size, which is our multiplayer size. And so we would have to create a version of Kate that is good for her campaign size, but then we'd also have to create a multiplayer version of her mesh that is the larger multiplayer size. And the reason that we do that is because we want to make sure that our multiplayer matches are a fair fight. It's not fair if one of the characters is smaller than the others. It gives them an advantage. So that's why we would have to create them. So I just wanted to call that out, so when you're looking at the video, you'll see some of the characters look smaller or larger than others. The other video caveat I want to say is, while I'm playing back this video, you're going to see some preview of the dynamics. You're going to see the particles and the collision objects. And so when we display that in the game, it kind of slows the simulation down. And so you might see some cloth that looks a little floaty, like it's in water. And so that is just a drawback of displaying those raw dynamics. So please try to ignore that. So here you can see we've got Kate. With her hair and her ponytail, but when we have multiple versions of Kate as well. So here's her desert uniform. So you can see she's got an extra scarf and the little tassels on it as well. So we had many different Kate outfits. And then we have Lonnie here, who has a lot of dreadlocks, obviously, but she has ropes and cloth, and her knife is moving and all that kind of stuff too. So she has a lot of dynamics on her. We have lots of different kinds of characters. So here you can see Lizzie has a bunch of tools in her tool belt, and her sweater arms are dangling as well. And then, like I said, our drones were the same meshes that were used in campaign that were used in multiplayer. And so here's a good example of, you can see those end anchors on those chains as you're swinging back and forth. And similarly here, on the Grenadier, he's got that long bit of leather cloth that's anchored at both ends. So the Hunter, she was probably our most complicated mesh to deal with in terms of performance outside of the Warden. And I'm going to talk a little bit about her later. And here's our Warden. So this was a multiplayer version of the Warden. So we had to make a smaller version because he's large in campaign. And we also had to optimize his dynamics to run at our performance goals for multiplayer. Of course, we have a lot of classic Gears characters like the Cantus. And Jermod is a new character for us. It was an interesting challenge with his cloak. So this is kind of where we started to get more away from thick leather and more into lighter cloth. And similarly for him. So that, was a new thing that we had to try with this system, and, it works pretty good. We were able to get a decent look here. Okay, so I'm going to move on now to talking about the carrier. And so the reason that I'm talking about the carrier is he doesn't have a lot of dynamics, but he has this big tail. And so this system was used for more than just, dynamics that you would expect, like hair and cloth and so on and so forth. So this guy, we actually needed to control his tail with dynamics because we just didn't have the animation resources to be able to make this work in all of the different slopes and climbing up on top of things and stuff like that. So in Gears 4, we also had the carrier. He wasn't a new character for Gears 5. And we drove his tail with physics. And so here we can see what happens when we remove the physics from the character. So his tail is just kind of floating above the ground. And that doesn't look very good, obviously. And so for Gears 5, we added rod dynamics to that tail. And so here you can see the tail is going to respect that slope in our gym here. It's kind of an extreme slope for him to be going up, and it's kind of maybe a little bit too far for him, but it is working and it's holding to the ground. And so basically the way that we set that up is we just had two rod dynamics nodes. So one for his spine, and you can kind of see that there's this kind of like a training wheel for it to kind of keep it so it doesn't flip forward on itself. And then we had a second rod dynamics node to just give it a little bit more twisting life on the end of it there. And so with just using those two nodes, we were able to generate all of the procedural animation that we needed for the carrier to move through all of the different environments that he has to work within. And so here is an example of him in campaign on this. This slope is actually kind of running downwards. It's kind of hard to tell from this, but you'll see.
Oh shit, carrier. Control, we can use those reinforcements right about now.
Condor's almost within range, Delta. Okay, kid, reinforcements incoming. I've got Guardians or DR1s. What do you want?
Dropping some DR1s.
You got it.
So you should never get too close to the carrier, obviously. Okay, so now I'm going to move on to the next section. I'm going to talk about the challenges that we ran into with rod dynamics. The main one being performance. I mean, with our performance goals of 60 frames a second in all game modes, we knew that was going to be a challenge from the start. So that was one of our main challenges. I'll also talk about the collision bugs that we were running into with this system. Because we had such a wide variety of things, of course, there's going to be some, when you apply generic animations onto things, things might not work out perfectly the way you expect. And I'll also talk about, it's a very specialized system. Nobody has this system except for us. We developed it. And so it's a very specialized workflow, which comes along with its own challenges. So for performance, by the time we got to alpha, we kind of discovered that the planned code optimizations that we had in mind, they were just not enough. It wasn't going to get us to the goal that we had in mind. And so we found that our worst case content, which at the time was actually Lonnie with her many dreads, she was costing us kind of twice as much as we wanted her to cost us. And so we established what our budget would be, our performance budget on XBoxOneX was 0.38 milliseconds per character. And so we had one exception to that, which was the Warden in campaign. So in campaign, the Warden was 0.49 milliseconds. We did, like I mentioned, we made a multiplayer version of the Warden, and we did get him down to 0.38. So he fit into budget no problem. So how do we solve these problems for performance? Well, the main start point, I guess, on this is we reduced our solver iterations. So if you remember back to when I started talking through the frame-by-frame example, and I would say that we would iteratively resolve between the collision constraints, getting outside of the collision, and the length constraints. Well, each of the, how many times you go through getting out of collision and reapplying the length constraint, that's the number of iterations. And so we had a number of 8. We had 8 iterations to start with. And then to get our performance down, we decided, well, we need to take that down to 2. And so we took that down to 2, and that was pretty good performance gain, but obviously it's pretty drastic change. We actually ultimately ended up going down to 1. And so when you go down to 1, you find that there's no real iteration here. And so the only thing that we were actually applying on those examples, on those cases where we reduced to 1, which was a lot, was that we would get the particles outside of collision, but we wouldn't apply the length constraint. So we were kind of cheating our own system in that sense to get performance back. But what we found is that the bones themselves, they're not going to be stretching. So they're always going to have their own length constraint kind of built into them. What that means, though, is that the particles positions and the bone positions weren't always kind of in the right, same location to each other. And so that was not great. But if you think about it, we're running, many frames over 1 second, right? And so the iteration kind of happens over multiple frames instead of within 1 frame. And so it kind of worked all right, actually. It was better than I expected. When you think about it conceptually, it's like, oh boy, that sounds like a bad idea, but it worked out. We also discovered that each of the rod dynamics nodes that we had set up, they had a major initialization cost. So it have to go through that node and gather all of the strands and all the collisions and kind of initialize all of that stuff. And that cost, it added up quite a bit. And so what that meant is that we had to rearrange our content into fewer nodes. Now, the problem with that is the collision. So the main knock-on was the collision setups for that. And so what that means is that if we start taking something that's on our foot and we start adding it to the rod dynamics node that has something on its chest, the collision has to work for both of those at the same time, because all of the collision applies to all of the strands that are in that same rod dynamics node. And so what that means is we had to stop using things like infinite planes and infinite cones and infinite frustrums, because if they're infinite, they're, if you had a plane to keep something down on the leg, well, if you had taken something in the chest and put it in that same node, well, the things that are in the chest are going to want to get underneath that thing too. So that's where we had to be like, okay, rip out all of these kind of infinite capsule or planes and such, and replace them with capsules, which are kind of more defined by the body. So that was a lot of rework, I would say, to kind of get that system performant. There was a few examples where we reduced the bone count, like Lonnie's hair. We actually did have to reduce a little bit, not too bad, and not in too many cases. So that wasn't super bad. So that did get us to our performance goals. It wasn't easy, but we got it done. So the next challenge was our collision bugs. And so, like I mentioned, we have generic animation, especially in multiplayer, that gets applied across a whole bunch of different characters. And so, one character's range of motion might not work very well on a different character's motion, depending on how that character is designed. And so here you can see a simple example here, and this is kind of a minor bug, but you can see that his front cloth is clipping right into his leg there. And so here we have this set up, and so you can see that the leg, the way it's animated, which is totally fine, it's just that when we have such cloth that's coming down so low on the leg, well, the leg just goes right over top of where that root bone is for that cloth. And so we would have to solve this by, pushing up the whole belt. So that's what this second node here does. And so you can see that now that belt is moving up with the legs. So the legs are pushing it up with, here you can see it's a single bone that has strand width on it, so that the legs would push that thing up, allowing the cloth strand roots to be outside of the legs to begin with. So we had a lot of little bugs like that we'd have to kind of fix. And when you're running around in gameplay, these are things that are kind of subtle. You might not notice them right away, but it's still important to address when you have certain close-ups. Okay, so the other major problem that we had was kind of a bigger problem, was fast movement was causing our strands to exit out on the opposite side of the collision from what we were intending. So our game, especially in multiplayer, characters can move so fast. They can bounce off of walls, they can twist around, they can flip around, they can do all kinds of things. And so you remember when I showed you the frame-by-frame example, and a particle was inside of the collision, well, it would kind of want to get out to the nearest exit of the collision. But the problem is that with the characters moving so fast, sometimes that particle would be kind of all the way into the other side of the collision, and then it would want to pop out to the opposite side and would get stuck there. And so that was kind of a problem for us. And so here you can see an example. If you watch his hood here, when he goes up against the wall, now one of those hood straps is kind of stuck above his head, and it kind of wanted to stay there. And so here you can see I'm testing this, and I'm trying to like make it go back, and so I have to do some more extreme motions, and there it pops back in. But then I'm like, okay, well, how did that happen? I try and recreate it again, and you can see I'm bouncing around, and it's not happening. So it was one of those bugs that's, when it happens, it's really bad, but it was hard to find it, and hard to find the situation that was causing it. And so our solution to that, unfortunately, was that we had to stiffen the strands up so that they didn't move as much, which, lowers our quality a little bit, but this was kind of getting late in the game. We kind of just had to do what we had to do in that situation. And the reason that we had to stiffen it on this character is because she was so performance costly. She has so many of these straps and stuff on her. We couldn't come up with something else. For other characters that had this problem, we had a different solution. So here you can see a character that doesn't have as much performance hindrance to her. And so what we could do is that we could increase the collision size for her head to be much larger, and we would separate it into two different nodes. And I'm just kind of going back and forth so you can see that the left side of her hair has a different collision setup and a different rod dynamics node than her right side. Now, the problem with that, of course, is you remember, as I said, each rod dynamics node has its own initialization cost. And so you can only do this on certain characters, whereas with the Hunter, since she was so costly overall, we couldn't separate her into separate nodes like that. So those are kind of the give and takes that you have to go through per character to kind of figure out how to make them performant and look good, as good as you can make them. Okay, so the other part that I wanted to talk about is when you're developing your own class system or dynamic system, it comes with its own set of challenges, and it's something to be aware of right from the start. And so this system, as we developed it, it went through a lot of changes and a lot of churn, and that meant for not just the system itself, but also the content that we were producing. And so you saw that there's a lot of parameters to adjust for this system. And so what this all means is that there's significant training ramp-up time for this system. And so if you think about, you have X number of riggers on your team, and if you're going through and you're changing the system, and then you're changing the content, and you're trying to keep the whole team abreast of all of those changes so that we're doing things consistently, that's an extreme challenge. It's really, really difficult. And so for us, well, we didn't go wide with the training on this system until we were done Gears 5 and we were into post-launch. And so that allowed us to keep our rigging team focused on basically all of the other things that needed to be done, which is there's a lot there for sure. Basically, I set up all of the dynamics myself because I was heavily invested with the development team of David Bolo was our engineer on this. And so we worked together a lot on making these changes and changing the content and all of that kind of stuff without pushing those changes to the team. Ultimately, it meant I was really busy, but leading the team and doing this. But it was the kind of the best approach in my mind, anyways. So that's why I put a question mark as a solution. Was that a solution? I don't know. Anyways, it's something to consider when you're developing your own system like this. That it's going to come with its own development cost in terms of you just have to count on it not working right the first time and be prepared for that. Okay, so now I'm going to move on to showing some results that were in our game. And so one of the new game modes that we have in Gears 5 is Escape. And so here you can see our main characters that were introduced for the Escape game mode. And here we have a video of Lonnie going through her intro cinematic right from the character select screen.
Okay, venom bomb set. We need to go. Gonna need a long soak after this. Venom's gonna touch off. Come on! We got a raven.
Okay, so here we have an example of multiplayer. And this is the hunter that I was talking about earlier. And I want to also show in this video that we were able to make her hood straps interact with the weapon that she's holding in her hand. And so we don't have interaction between a character and his weapons. It's just too costly to pass the information back and forth between those assets that are swappable. And so we just mimicked it by adding a collision capsule to the hand of the character itself. And that worked out pretty good. And then here's an example of one of our characters called Germaud. This is the one with the cloak that I was showing off earlier. So we didn't just use this dynamic systems on our characters. We also used it on our weapons that had some little bits that would move on it. We also used it on the skiff, which was the main campaign vehicle that we have in Gears 5. And so here you can see that there's some ropes that are dangling off of the sail. So those were all driven by rod dynamics.
Del, it's been hours. Tell me we're getting close.
Marcus's coordinates put New Hope in valley up ahead. So we're close.
Okay, and then finally here we have some cinematics. And so, like I said, one of the main goals that we had for this system was also to work in our cinematics in real time. And so in these video clips that I have of two cinematics here, I kind of swipe back and forth between showing the raw dynamics view like you see here and not having them so you can actually see how they're performing. Yeah, so let's just watch this.
Kate is not ready for this. She can barely keep her eyes open.
Don't worry about her. She'll be ready.
Okay, we're almost at Bear's coordinates. Welcome to Azura.
When's the last time you slept?
Last night. Got a good 8 or 9 minutes in.
Nightmares?
Does it get better?
It gets tolerable.
All right, let's see what we got. Come on, time to hook in for the drop.
So who's jumping first?
Definitely not you.
Del, I'm fine, okay?
Sure you are.
Oh, shit. Thanks, Del.
Sam, we're outgoing.
Roger that. We're standing by out here.
See you soon. Hey, Dave, you coming?
You failed us!
Failed us? What are you?
We are what you could have been.
Go, now!
We are a complete being, connected, immortal. You had a choice, and you squandered it. Alive or dead, you belong to us.
Okay, so to summarize, we made a custom dynamic system, and that system comes with development costs. So there's the time for your engineers to develop it. There's the time for your technical artists to use it and to learn from it and to suggest changes and all of that kind of thing. And so those are something that you have to ask yourself before you take on some kind of a system like this. So ultimately, we have to ask ourselves, was it worth it to develop this system? And so the only way that I really have to answer that is, were we able to achieve our goals? And I'd say the answer is yes. We were able to hit our visual quality bars that we were setting for ourselves. We were able to hit performance targets that we needed, which were very aggressive, I gotta say. And then we also were able to support all of the secondary, like you saw there, for the hair and the cloth and all that kind of stuff in our real-time cinematics. And we also were able to make a unified system by building this system. So yeah, it was worth it for us. The cost was, not outlandish. It wasn't free, so somewhere in between those. But it worked out pretty good. So now I'll leave you with a question slide where you can't really ask the questions, since this isn't a live presentation, unfortunately. But if you want to reach out to me, and I hope I don't regret this by getting too many questions, but you can find me on LinkedIn, I'm sure, and I'll try my best to answer any questions that you may have. You'll also notice that I've linked in here 2 links to the papers themselves that our raw dynamic system was based upon, so that you can check that out for yourselves. So thanks very much for watching, and have a good one.